Good morning, Vincent and Augustin. Thank you for joining us today to discuss about this very important topic on energy transition and the target of net zero carbon emission. That's true that on this topic we often discuss about renewables, energy efficiencies. We less often discuss about how the fossil fuel can play a role, and especially natural gas and LNG, considered as the cleanest of the fossil fuel energy. I think they have a good role to play in that field and to combat global warming. So with us today, Vincent Desmory. So Vincent is the General Secretary of GIGNL, which is the international group of LNG importers. And this not-for-profit organization has members of all the major players of LNG importers and regasification. And then we have Augustin Pratt. So Augustin, you are VP Product for Energy and Commodities Markets. You are from Kairos, a French tech company, specialized, very focused on Earth analytics. You will explain us all of that later, and you will explain how you support the biggest industries in their roadmap for decarbonization. So now we're going to enter into the debate. First questions for Vincent. First of all, to set the scene, maybe you can explain us what is the place today of natural gas, LNG, in the energy mix, and how natural gas emission compared to the other fossil fuel energies. And maybe you can walk us through the value chain of LNG?
Sure. So, first of all, good morning, everyone. So, natural gas demand today, it's about 25% of primary energy demand worldwide. And LNG is about 12% of this. So, LNG is only a fraction of the natural gas chain. However, it's an important one, and it's a growing one. We estimate that LNG is growing at about 3 to 4% per year on average, and will grow at that pace in the upcoming 20 years. And we estimate that the LNG market will double between now and 2040. If you look at the number of LNG importing countries since the beginning of the century, the number of importing countries has been multiplied by 4. So it's a very significant increase. Why? Because LNG, as opposed to coal or oil, emits significantly fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So it's definitely the cleanest burning hydrocarbon. LNG is also flexible. It can be distributed in small parcels. It can be sent to different regions of the world, which is not the case of pipeline gas, where you have fixed infrastructure linking exporting countries to importing countries. So there is an element also of flexibility and supply security through diversification of supplies. LNG is very important for many countries to diversify their energy supply sources. And we are seeing that as an example. I could take Eastern European countries like Lithuania or Poland, for instance, who have become LNG importers recently, which allow them to diversify from their existing source, which was mainly Russian gas. So it's an important element also of supply security increasingly. But there are many other benefits that we will talk about later. I would say that the biggest one is that it enables to switch to lower carbon fuels, even lower carbon than LNG. If you think of fuels like hydrogen, for instance, or bio-LNG or synthetic LNG, which are really the future for low carbon energy market.
Justin, you want to add something on that?
No, I think Vincent gave a very clear picture. So.
Okay, so maybe Vincent, to continue on that, what are the actions and remedies that your industry is putting together to decarbonize?
Well, let's make no mistake, LNG remains a product which has a carbon content, and so the industry cannot, cannot overlook this, and we need to reduce the carbon footprint of the industry as much as possible. So that being said, what we need to keep in mind is that the greenhouse gas emissions from the natural gas supply chain occur mostly in the downstream sector. 75% of the emissions happen between the regasification terminal and the use by the end user, so at combustion. And 25% only of the greenhouse gas emissions occur between exploration and regasification. So that's important to keep in mind, to know what the industry can do, because the industry can act mainly on this 25% as a start. So what does it do? We can first step is to avoid and reduce emissions as much as possible. Which emissions? Well, CO2 emissions, of course. During the extraction phase, during the liquefaction phase, there are some CO2 emissions, but there are ways to reduce these emissions. And there are different techniques, different best practices that are being implemented. One of them is electric liquefaction. So at the liquefaction plants, the engines are driven by electricity. And this electricity can be drawn from renewable electricity, so that helps significantly reduce emissions. You have also carbon capture and storage at the production, so upstream. So this is, for instance, what the Gorgon project in Australia is doing, what the Qataris aim to do on the expansion of the North Field project. And there are other technologies that help decarbonize along the whole value chain. In shipping, what digital technologies help reduce boil-off, help optimize the routes, and so each segment of the value chain has its own technologies that can help decarbonize. Then the second action to decarbonize is offsetting, what we call carbon neutral LNG or carbon offset LNG. This is a growing trend. This is still in infancy, but we think that it will grow exponentially as voluntary and regulatory commitments to carbon neutrality are multiplying. So this is the second action, but maybe we will talk about it a bit later.
Maybe we can move to digitalization, and how can digitalization help in decarbonization? And maybe, Augustin, you can explain a little bit how a company like yours can support companies to decarbonize.
Sure. So, as Vincent said, there are two main greenhouse gases emitted in the LNG process. It's the CO2 and methane. At Kairos, we really focus on methane, and we really think that methane is the low-hanging fruit of reducing the carbon footprint of LNG. Again, focusing on the upstream part here, because downstream, the combustion, it's much harder to mitigate emissions from combustion, but you can mitigate a lot of emissions from the upstream part. And there's a 25% figure that Vincent gave in terms of the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions in CO2 equivalent emitted during the upstream, in the upstream part of the activity of the supply chain. There's a huge variability in that 25% because of methane, and because methane, CO2 is a byproduct of combustion. Methane is leaked. So CO2 is something that can be estimated relatively easily. Methane emissions, they are very volatile by essence because they are due to leaks. So they can vary from 1 to 10, from 1 to 100 in terms of their impact. So 25% may be an average, but in the worst cases, you may have 50 or over 50% of the greenhouse gas potential in the upstream part. So what we do at Kairos for this is we developed a tool to monitor methane leaks by satellite. Not all methane leaks, not the small ones, but the methane leaks from what we call super emitters who emit more than 1 ton per hour of methane. And this is a huge low-hanging fruit for the decarbonization of the LNG supply chain if you can mitigate those super emitters.
Thank you, Augustin. And if we look at the limits or the constraints that you find in the decarbonization of the value chain, what are those?
Well, first of all, in order to decarbonize or in order to offset the residual emissions from the chain, you need to quantify. And that's where technologies can help, because you need to have an exact picture of the footprint of your value chain. And this is where you have different approaches and where the industry still has some homework to do. LNG has an advantage over other commodities because it's relatively contained. I mean, you know where your LNG is going. It's on a ship, basically. It's produced in a liquefaction plant, then transported on a ship, then it's distributed. I mean, it's unloaded in a regasification terminal. So it's relatively easy to trace the emissions as opposed to other commodities. So I would say the constraints are more on the methodological side to make sure that everybody applies credible standards, credible references to quantify the emissions. And that's exactly what we are doing at GIGNL. We are working on what we call MRV, the monitoring, reporting, and verification methodologies for LNG emissions. Because today, there is no LNG-specific framework to quantify emissions. Whether it is CO2 or methane or nitrous oxides, this still need to be defined at industry level. So that's what we're doing.
Do you think that cost also could be a limit? The cost to decarbonize?
Well, cost is important indeed. I mean, affordability of LNG is critical, especially when you think of developing countries like India, who are very price sensitive. If you are adding an extra cost to their energy supplies, then you may make LNG less competitive than other alternatives. You have to keep in mind that today, 60% of power generation in Asia is still fueled by coal. And this is incredible in the world that we're living in, to see still such a significant amount of power generated with coal plants when you think of the climate impact. So we need to do something. And the quickest way to reduce these emissions is to switch to natural gas and LNG, because on a life cycle basis, LNG emits 45 to 55% less greenhouse gas emissions than coal when it is used to generate electricity. So this is I would say, also the low-hanging fruit, to take the same expression as Augustin. But of course, it's an important component. And then if we talk about the extra cost of offsetting, you have to compare it with the cost of the externalities, of course, of more polluting fuels. And here, if you take an example of carbon credits at $10 per ton of CO2 equivalent, it means that on an LNG cargo, you will be adding another $2.5 million to the cost of your LNG cargo. This is equivalent to about 60 cents or 80 cents per million BTU. It gives you an idea. Today, LNG in Asia is sold for $12 or $13 per million BTU. So you would be adding 60 cents or 80 cents out of 12 or 13. So you can easily see that this ratio may not be so high compared with the cost of the externalities of more polluting fuels.
So what sector do you see switching to LNG to help them decarbonize their footprint? You see new sectors coming in?
Well, theoretically, all sectors could switch to carbon neutral LNG, and the power sector is of course, one of the first candidates to use carbon neutral LNG. Today, most of the transactions that we have seen in carbon neutral LNG occurred in Northeast Asia. That doesn't mean it will not change, because Europe will also be demanding carbon neutral LNG. We think that industry and manufacturing industry will be a big customer for carbon neutral LNG. High tech also, companies in the high tech sector are demanding for carbon neutral energy, and possibly also data centers, which are requiring a lot of energy. So very different sectors. If you take the example of Japan, Tokyo Gas imported a cargo of carbon neutral LNG, and the customers were as different as a real estate company building district heating and cooling. You had a beverage manufacturer, I think it was Asahi beer. So it really ranges between very, very different sectors.
And Augustin, how do you help companies, because Vincent touched base on the communication, how to communicate on standardized reports, etc. Do you support companies in that area to help them to communicate on their carbon footprint?
Absolutely, yeah. The aim. So what you see on the screen here is typically. So it's very small on the right, but you see a leak from a gas field. That's in North Africa, but you see that happening really across the globe. You can see on the map here all the places where we detected methane leaks by satellite. So our objective is really to help the companies improve their reporting in terms of carbon footprint. And methane at the moment is kind of forgotten often. There is a big focus on CO2, but when you talk about LNG, really methane is the key. So what we want is to help the companies in their reporting and improve the standards for reporting also, because touching on what Vincent just said, there is as many standards for reporting as there are people who report, or there is so many methodologies. There is not yet a clear path towards regulation that has set standards for reporting. So we are really trying to help in that direction by like Vincent, what we want is a standard reporting methodology that takes into account CO2 and methane, where really you can compare apples to apples. The companies and the regulators will have to take part in that, and also like industry representatives like GI, GNL, and Keros, because what's key is to have science-based measurements inside those methodologies. You will need to include measurements, otherwise it becomes something where everyone can have their own ways to estimate their carbon footprint. So yes, that's the way we try to help the companies improve their reporting of CO2 or GHG gas emissions.
Thank you, Augustin. And maybe before we close the keynote, before Q&A, if there are, is there something specific to conclude this keynote that you want to say?
No, I think what we can say is that technology can really help decarbonize the entire LNG supply chain, and it can also help the industry solve the issue of tracing the greenhouse gas emissions, and also tracing their offsets and the credibility, the quality, and the retirement of the carbon offsets. And that's why it's an important part of the industry's evolution.
Yeah, I would second what Vincent said, and the credibility word is super important. Long term for any industry, you need to keep your right to operate, and that means keeping your credibility. And to keep credibility, when we're talking about reporting of and measurement and reporting of GHG emissions, CO2 and methane here for when we talk about the LNG supply chain, it is key to have a standardization of the methodologies. It's clear that without that, there will be a loss of credibility when it comes to the carbon offsets that you choose, the reporting of your methane or CO2 emissions in the upstream sector. There will need to be measurements. So this is where we play a part, helping companies include science and measurements in their reporting of emissions, and trying to go to our same goal of standardization of reporting of such emissions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for what you do for the energy transition. And then I don't know if there are any questions. Je ne sais pas si...
Un autre micro.
Identified concretely either regasification terminals or LNG production sites as big emitters?
Not the regas terminals or the LNG production sites. I think we're looking at leaks here that are of a very large magnitude. Wouldn't happen in those places. What we have identified is leaks mostly in the upstream gas fields that then feed the liquefaction terminals, or in the pipelines also that either or the alternative to LNG, or the pipelines that serve the LNG liquefaction plants, but not in the terminals themselves.
My question for Vincent, what's the current state of the LNG resources and stocks, and can it replace some fossil fuels in, let's say, 50 years, 100 years? Is the potential sufficient in terms of resources available?
Of reserves of natural gas? Yes. So it's a good question. LNG is basically natural gas. So you can produce LNG wherever you have big reserves of natural gas. Today, there are still reserves of natural gas at the global level for about 80 years of production at the current demand level. So no question about the availability of the gas. And on the availability of LNG, you have today about 890 million tons per annum of liquefaction projects, which could become available by 2030 if they are all realized. So, and for a market which is today about 350 million tons, so more than double the current market. So no question about the availability of the products, which is also a good point for LNG as a potential fuel for the energy transition.
And you mentioned the possibility to have neutral or carbon neutral LNG by offsetting. Don't you fear that offsetting will be considered as a way to, well, a way of greenwashing LNG rather than addressing the real issue?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. There is the risk, of course, that the label carbon neutral LNG could be a way used by some players to just discard the efforts that they need to make in terms of reduction of emissions. This is why, in the framework that we are currently defining within GIGNL, we want to make reduction of emissions also mandatory, and we want the players who report their LNG as carbon neutral to also commit to reduction efforts. So reduction and offsetting will have to go hand in hand. Otherwise, you will not be able to claim carbon neutrality. And I think it's important that we set this reference. Otherwise, as you said, there could be some problems, and offsetting would only be contributing theoretically to carbon neutrality, but not in effect. So that's why we need to be very strict on this.
No further questions? No? Well, thank you very much for attending this session, and thank you to Augustin and Vincent.
Thank you very much for hosting.